ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Hi, it's PK here from the podcast Politics Now. And as the politicians hit the streets this election campaign, we'll help you navigate the spin.
He said, sometimes I'll go into a press conference and I'll drop a little something that I know will annoy lefties.
And bring you the deeper analysis on what matters to you. It's called Politics Now, and you can find it on the ABC Listen app.
It's barely raised a mention during the election campaign, but the rental crisis remains one of the biggest issues the nation is grappling with. Skyrocketing rents mean families on an average income have been priced out of a third of postcodes in 5 capital cities, with Perth now overtaking Sydney as the least affordable place to rent. Today, reporter Inga Ting on the latest data, how it's ended up this way and how we get out of it. I'm Sam Hawley on Gadigal land in Sydney. This is ABC News Daily. Inga, we've spent a lot of time on the podcast talking about the housing crisis for people trying to get into the market. But the thing is, if you can't buy a house, you have to rent. And these days, that's even out of reach. You've been diving into some new data which shows us just how hard it's become. Tell me about that.
So we've been shared some exclusive figures from a Melbourne-based consultancy called SGS Economics and Planning and the peak housing body National Shelter. And so what the data tells us broadly about affordability is that average income households are now increasingly being priced out of the neighbourhoods where they used to live, where traditionally we've thought of as being affordable areas. So rent now is eating into more of people's household income than at any time before. It's the worst on record. And just for some background, a postcode is considered unaffordable when the median rent costs 30% or more of your household income before tax. So that's a commonly used threshold.
Right. So wages are not keeping up with the increases in rents, and that's happening almost everywhere. One example is on the Gold Coast. Just tell me about what's happening there, because that's a really interesting case. And tell me about Melanie, because she's paying this massive amount of money on rent.
So regional Queensland has actually seen rents rise faster than any other regional area in Australia. And within regional Queensland, particularly hard hit has been the Gold Coast and the Sunshine Coast. So what we see on the Gold Coast, for example, is that there is not a single postcode within that area that is within reach for the average income rental household. Melanie Mizuraka and her 2 daughters, Jaslyn and Nala, who are 17 and 10, they live on the Gold Coast. She's a single mum.
I've been renting most of my life, and you paid for a nice home, but you also had money to be able to save and do the things that you needed to do or would like to do as well. Since COVID, it's been quite challenging for us.
They were paying $380 a week at the place where they'd lived for about 9 years. But then once the pandemic lockdowns kind of ended and things kind of settled down a little, they were forced to move. So that was in 2022 and they managed to find another place, but it's way smaller. It's about half the size.
It's coming up to the 3rd year now we've been here, so it's gone up 3 times. And I've already signed the lease for the new rental cost. It will be going up to $650 a week.
They'll be paying $650 a week from September, up from $380 previously.
Wow, that's a big increase, isn't it?
Yeah.
And Melanie's working a lot of jobs, right, to try and make this money.
Yeah, exactly. So the single mum is working cleaning, gardening and pet care jobs. She gets some Centrelink payments and altogether that brings in about $900 a week. And then her 17-year-old is also working now. She's just finished school and so she has a job at a local shop and she brings in $300 a week. So their combined household income is $1,100 and their rent by September will be taking up 54% of their household income.
Look, we honestly live very basically. So we only pay for what we need, Wi-Fi at home, petrol in the car, stuff like that. We get a haircut once a year. We can ride our push bikes, walk places, just to cut down costs in any way we can.
Oh my gosh, that's such a lot, isn't it? And the thing is, Inga, that it doesn't really matter where you're renting at this point. People are being priced out all over the place, in most places.
Yeah, exactly. So if we look at Perth, for example, I think people in Australia often think of Sydney as being the most unaffordable place to rent, but Perth is actually Australia's worst city for renters. It overtook Sydney in 2024.
Oh, wow.
And what our analysis showed is that at the start of the pandemic, just 2% of the postcodes in Perth were out of reach for the average income rental household. But 4 years later, it's now 70% of postcodes. That's the same story in Adelaide. It went from less than 2% to 70% of postcodes being out of reach for the average income rental household. In Sydney, we know it's been bad for a long time, but those two places actually make Sydney sound pretty good.
Yes. Oh my gosh.
We've gone from less than 17% at the time of the pandemic to 55% of postcodes being out of reach for the average renter. And then regional Queensland, which we talked about before, about half of regional Queensland now is unaffordable for even average income rental households.
Oh my gosh.
So it's all over the place, really. Brisbane, Hobart, regional New South Wales as well. Now 40% of postcodes in those places are out of reach. And those are huge increases over just 4 years.
Yeah, it's just getting worse and worse. Has it always been this way? Has it always been so bad that things just become unattainable?
So things have actually gotten worse fast. So Ellen Witter, who's the author of the yearly Rental Affordability Index reports that come out based on this data, she says that when the index first started about 10 years ago, unaffordability used to be centred in the inner city and around service hubs that were close to jobs and public transport. So it wasn't such a widespread phenomenon. But according to the data now that we analyse, in almost every capital city, even the average income renter has been pushed to the margins. So really what it means is that Australian cities are no longer for everyone.
I think in the past we would have had a mixture of all sorts of households in our communities, from the barista to your nurse to someone who runs a business. And now increasingly what we see in the inner cities is many households cannot afford to live there.
Geography is really segregating different groups of people. They're becoming, she uses the term, two-faced. So this is a term that economists use to describe cities that have very sharp geographical divides between the rich and poor.
There are households who can afford life in the city, close to job services, recreation and going out to restaurants. And then there are increasingly many households who live further out and do not have all that access to the great services that these cities often offer.
There's a huge division between households that can afford to live in the city, and then there's everyone else who has to live further and further out, and they have to commute long distances, or they just have to give up the jobs and the life that they want.
All right. And Inga, the thing is, all this data that you've been talking about, it's looking at average income households. So we're not really talking there about, pensioners, students, single parents, people who don't earn an average income, who earn less than that.
Exactly. An average income household is actually a dual income household in this data set. So if a dual income household isn't even able to afford the vast majority of postcodes in a city, we're talking about something very severe. And in the last Rental Affordability Index, they actually added a new category to describe places that were critically unaffordable. So where a household would have to pay at least 75% of their income to cover the rent. That's how desperate that situation is for single and low income households.
So that really shows that whole cohorts of the population are excluded from parts of the housing market and parts of cities. And that's
when we start to look at this, we need to ask, who gets to live in the cities then? If huge swathes of the city are becoming unaffordable, what kinds of cities are we going to be living in the future, or even now? So Brendan Coates from the Grattan Institute says unaffordable rents actually make cities very segregated.
Because that growing divide between the housing haves and have-nots is increasingly determining, people's outcomes in life. It matters much more than it did in the past who your parents are than perhaps, your own endeavours in life in determining what kind of housing you get to enjoy.
And it has really negative impacts on people's lives. It's not just about affording your rent or living in a nice house. It's actually that housing in Australia has become one of the determining factors in all sorts of outcomes in life. If you have a house or you have housing wealth or you don't, that can impact your health. It impacts your mental health. It impacts your sense of belonging in society. It's really about the social fabric of Australia. It creates tension between communities. So there's tension between renters and owners. There's tensions between the young and the old, people who were kind of born into housing wealth and those who just can't get a foot in the door.
Historically, we've been worried about people's ability to buy their first home, to become homeowners and participate in that great Australian dream. Now I think we're having a different conversation about, can people afford to literally keep a roof over their head in major cities like Sydney, Perth, Brisbane and Melbourne?
And if we go back to the example of Melanie on the Gold Coast, she says she's filled with dread every time the family's lease renewal comes around.
It's very stressful and daunting just thinking how much are they going to put it up next? And if I can't afford it, what on earth am I going to do?
So, Inga, we are, of course, in the middle of a federal election campaign. Have we seen anything from the major parties when it comes to relief for renters, given it is such a big issue?
It is a huge issue. We have seen some promises. What Labor has done is said that it will use the Australia Future Fund to deliver more housing, with the idea behind that being that will increase the supply of homes and then open up more opportunity for rentals to come onto market and ease pressure that way. The coalition has measures to cap international student numbers, and their argument there is that reducing immigration and international student numbers would actually reduce demand on the rental market and help with supply. Although there was some research that came out just this week, in fact, that cast doubt on whether international student numbers actually do impact rentals very much. So we're not sure what kind of impact that will have. And the Greens are still arguing for caps on rental increases. A few of the economists that the ABC spoke to, they actually are advocating strongly for replacing stamp duty with a land tax, with evidence showing that this helps to cap house prices. And if we can help wealthier renters into the home ownership market, then that would take them out of the rental market and actually ease pressure at that higher end.
But Inga, if we did all of those things, what do the experts say? Would that be enough? What can actually be done to ease this massive pressure on people renting?
So there is a big lag in any measure that looks at building more homes or bringing supply onto the market, because it's housing. It takes a long time to build. It takes a long time for people to shift their finances. From taking a measure like that to putting keys in front doors is a long time. But what we can look to, which is really interesting in the data, is COVID. So we actually saw, for the first time in 14 years of data, we saw an improvement in the situation for renters and in rental affordability around COVID. And what we see there is that there were some immediate measures that took effect. So there was, for example, the moratorium on evictions and rent increases. there were just basically far more rights for renters because of such an extreme situation around lockdowns. We can also look to what's happened in Canberra as well. So there's a lot of international evidence that backs this, but we've got domestic evidence that shows that capping rent increases does work. Rent increases in Canberra have been capped since 2019, and Canberra is the only Australian city where rental affordability hasn't deteriorated since the pandemic. So what that suggests is that, the property market, it doesn't collapse, as many say it would if you capped rental increases, but actually it did make a huge impact on renters there.
Inga Ting is a data journalist with the ABC's Digital Story Innovations team. This episode was produced by Sydney Peed and Sam Dunn. Audio production by Adair Shepherd. Our supervising producer is David Cody. I'm Sam Hawley. To get in touch with the team, please email us on ABC News Daily at abc.net.au. Thanks for listening.